Edward Thomson joins us today on the Azure DevOps Podcast.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the Azure DevOps Podcast. As you can hear, we are recording from Microsoft Ignite, which you can go online to www.azuredevops.show to see show notes and other episodes. If you've just started listening, go to the website or your favorite podcast directory. We have episodes with Buck Hodges, the engineering manager for Azure DevOps Services. We have Donovan Brown, cloud DevOps advocate. And we have Sam Guggenheimer, product owner for all of Azure DevOps product line. And here at the Microsoft Ignite conference, today's guest is Edward Thomson, and he's a principal program manager for Azure DevOps. He is the maintainer of libgit2, the Git library, a host of All Things Git, the podcast about Git at allthingsgit.com, and the curator of developer tools at developertoolsweekly.com. Edward, you can feel the excitement from the expo hall all around us. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm great. You can feel this excitement, and I'm sure the listeners can hear it. It's there's a lot going on around here, and we're in the quiet area, right? This is the podcast area where they try to keep it quiet, but man, there's a lot of stuff going on.
How many steps do you have today?
Oh, you know what? I don't record those. I don't. I got a real watch.
Yeah, I just can't wear watches. For years, I just don't have anything, so I don't know how many steps, but all I know is my feet hurt.
I'm telling you, this convention center is huge. Yeah.
So your calendar was completely clear today, so you've had a lot of rest, right?
I'm totally clear, yeah. It was supposed to be a light day. I was going to work on my talks. I was going to, hang out at the booth and talk to people. But in fact, I set up the booth this morning and then I haven't been back. So I've had customer meetings and talking to other, people within Microsoft. It's been a busy day. I'm glad to sit down though. This is great.
Yeah, the chairs, hey, not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad for a podcast studio.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's nice. The sessions... This convention center here in Orlando is massive.
Oh, man.
And we have the expo hall and the community areas and the product booths. One thing that's really awesome, there's people taking certification exams for half price here at the conference. And
awesome.
So that's pretty cool. I mean, you cannot do it all here. You have to pick.
No, you cannot do it all. You absolutely cannot. There are so many great sessions. There are so many great things going on around us. Like you mentioned, the certifications, the expo. Channel 9 is filming over right out,
Yeah, we're watching Channel 9. We're watching a live show on Channel 9 right now.
Yeah, so Ignite is just a massive event. There's so much going on. It's incredible.
Well, for the listeners who might not be as familiar with you, how's your journey been? How did you land at Microsoft and in the role that you're currently in?
Oh, wow. So I landed at Microsoft, but not even remotely in the role that I'm currently in. So I worked with a couple of, who are now my really close friends, at this tiny little startup called Teamprise. And Teamprise was, 10 years ago, we were building a cross-platform client, I guess, for what was then Team Foundation Server. And so I worked there with my buddy Martin, who's now my boss, surprisingly, and my buddy Shaw, who...
And that's Martin Woodward.
Martin Woodward, yeah, who you'll need to have on the show at some point.
I will. You listening, Martin?
Yeah,
I will.
Exactly. And my buddy Shaw, we worked for Corey. This was such a tight little company. We were just a really small ragtag group. And Microsoft ended up acquiring us. So they brought in, Martin, me, and Shaw into Microsoft, and Corey was there for a year. And so I could not believe that we ended up there. To go from a company that is, 10 people to a company that is Microsoft was just mind-blowing. And so I was a software engineer there. And I did that for a number of years. We did a lot during that time that I'm really proud of, really excited about. But at some point I realized, I looked around and I missed working at a startup. So I left, I went to GitHub, I was a software engineer there for a little while. And then I realized that what I really wanted to do was maybe take a step away from writing code on a day-to-day basis as what I did. And so I came back to Microsoft as a program manager. And so that's how I ended up in my current role.
Awesome. That's quite a journey. I do remember everybody used Teamprise.
It seemed like it.
It was obvious. Of course, Microsoft should acquire it.
Yeah. It wasn't so obvious for us. We were sitting there, we were at startup. Some days we're like, what does our future even look like? Will we be able to survive? What if Microsoft decides to do this themselves? Will they just put us out of business?
Yeah.
But no, I think in retrospect it probably was obvious. Honestly, just to have those people within Microsoft, like Martin, was one of the people responsible for open sourcing .NET and bringing Git into Microsoft and all these things. So, the acquisition might have been worth it just for Martin alone. Mm-hmm. So it's in retrospect, yeah, I think it's obvious, but at the time, it felt anything but obvious to us.
Gotcha. Now, this the work that you've been doing with Git, did that precede you joining Microsoft?
No. So that all started with Git at Microsoft. But when Teamprise was acquired, so here's a strange little organizational thing. Teamprise was part of another company called SourceGear. SourceGear builds version control software. That's what they...
And SourceGear Vault is what they got famous for.
Yeah, and Source Offsite before that. And while they were working on... while Teamprise was working on Teamprise, SourceGear was working on a product called Veracity, which is a distributed version control system and distributed bug tracking system. So I actually started getting familiar with distributed version control before Teamprise was acquired by Microsoft. But then I kind of put that on hold. Wasn't really working on anything remotely related to that while I was at Microsoft for the first couple of years. And then Martin looks at me and he's like, we need distributed version control in Visual Studio Team Services and in Visual Studio. And I was like, nah, what? That's crazy. And so we thought about it for a little while, and that's when we started paying attention to Git. We thought about doing our own thing. We thought about Mercurial. We thought about Git. And ultimately, we started realizing that Git was taking over. Mm-hmm. And indeed it did. So that's when I started really paying attention to Git.
Yeah. And Git really has taken over. If you're actively working on software today, there's not many reasons why you wouldn't store your code on some Git server somewhere.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? The last Stack Overflow survey, I think 90% of professional developers use Git. Mm-hmm. Maybe not exclusively. Maybe they, still use, I don't know, some legacy system or Team Foundation version control or, Mercurial. But yeah, at some point they interact with Git. It's crazy.
That's right. And I remember doing some projects where we actually went from Subversion to Mercurial. We bet wrong.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, which one of these is gonna play out here?
Right.
Bet wrong. And we wouldn't a year before we realized, oh yeah, okay, Git's actually getting more traction. And
you can be forgiven for that because at the time, using Git on Windows was just painful.
Command line only.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Until Tortoise Git came around.
Right. Command line only, A, and B, until like the Git for Windows installer and would bootstrap this system for you, you either had to, I don't even remember, but it involved like many manual installation steps. You had to either decide whether you wanted to use MSys or Cygwin and then set that environment up. It was not cool. So Git for Windows really changed all that. But until that happened, Mercurial seemed like the obvious choice to use, at least on Windows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with that, we'll take a word from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
All right, back here with Edward Thomson. So, libgit, what's all that about, and what the heck is it?
Yeah, it's actually libgit2, and the 2 is important because...
Well, what happened to libgit 1?
See, and that's why the 2 is important. So what happens is when you build Git, when you run make, when you clone the Git repository, Git itself, and run make, what it'll do is it'll build a static library of some of its commonly used functions. And of course, that's called libgit. And so Git is, in the Unix tradition, a bunch of independent tools that talk to each other. And so that's why that library exists. And it's really just for the Git tools themselves. You can't, as an application developer, link into that easily. libgit2, however, the idea is to take all of the Git functionality and put it into a library that, as an application developer, you can use. And so that's it's the next step of a linkable Git library. And so, various products use libgit2. You've got, GitHub, for example, and Azure repos. So when you click merge pull request on, pretty much any Git hosting provider, it's actually libgit2 that's doing that work. And then we're used in GUIs as well. Git Kraken and Source Tree both use libgit2. The Gmaster client uses libgit2. So a lot of people are actually interacting with libgit2 on a day-to-day basis. In fact, probably every Git user somehow or another uses libgit2, even if they don't know it. So that's libgit2 in a nutshell.
And is that where enhancements came that were required? We've heard from the Windows team to be able to use Git and all these other massive repositories, or is that a different place?
So interestingly, that's a different place. All of those contributions went back into Git, the command line, so that they didn't have to go into 2 different places.
Okay.
Because you've got to have the Git command line for developers, right? Even if you don't like the command line, you've probably got to drop to it at some point. So all of the enhancements in scaling Git up to the Windows repository had to happen in Git itself. So they actually haven't made it yet to libgit2 or any of the other Git libraries. There's one for Java called JGit. But that's something that I'm interested in seeing happen.
Okay. So we have Azure repos, and some number of years ago, I forgot how many years ago, Git has actually been part of the product,
right.
VSTS, but it's been enhanced greatly to support really large and massive repositories. There's really not. Can anyone say that their source code won't work with Git these days?
That's a good question. I think that there are probably some workflows that still are high friction. I was at GDC, the Game Developer Conference, earlier this year, and seeing some
Did you win?
The only way to win is not to play. I talk to a lot of game developers, and a lot of them have workflows that a centralized version control system still makes a lot of sense for. Something like TFVC, especially around artwork, because A, they're big, and B, you want exclusive locks on that because you can't merge them. And so if I'm editing, I don't know, a movie that gets played like in the splash screen when you're during the loading of the game or something like that, I want to make sure that I can exclusively lock that file. That way, somebody else doesn't try to make an edit to the movie and save it, because you can't merge that. And one of us just lost a lot of time. So that workflow is still, it doesn't need to be centralized per se, but the locking is really important. So,
okay.
And you can get some of that with Git. So Git LFS 2.0 added locking, but it's still just not a workflow.
An acronym police, LFS stands for?
I'm sorry, Git large file support. So Git large file support 1.0, Git LFS 1.0, allowed you to manage large files in Git better. So what it does is instead of checking in the actual large file into your repository, it checks in just a stub, a little metadata file describing the large file, and then it sticks the large file, it hands it up to the hosting provider like GitHub or Azure repos, and they'll store that separately. And then when you clone the repository, you just download, instead of downloading the history with all of those big files, you download just those little metadata files. And then when you go to check out the most recent versions, it'll download those on demand. So it's a really nice space-saving, mechanism in the repository, and that's what allows it to handle large files gracefully. 2.0 added a command called git LFS lock. So you can run git LFS lock on a file and exclusively lock it. But the integration still is, it's not as mature as what you'll see in, say, TFVC with the actual ability to lock files. So I think that there's still some work to do there around the game developer workflow. But by and large, I think most people are going to be comfortable with Git in 2018.
Now, we can all see that text-based files of all types are mergeable, and that's fine. You mentioned movie files, which I don't think a lot of people immediately think, oh, I'm going to version control this MP4 or this other FLV or
right.
and audio files and all other types of binary formats. Heck, Word documents, PowerPoint, just anything that's that is not human readable text,
right,
all up and down. So, are there a lot of people that just are using? Where does it break down?
Yeah, I'm gonna say that if you have assets for your software that actually describe something and they tie into the version that you have checked out, that you should check them into your repository as well, right? If you have a Word document, and this is a bad example, right? You would never use Word for this, you'd use Markdown. But if you had a Word document that described how to get started building your code, like for a new hire, for instance, you should check that in right alongside your code, because it's going to change, as your code changes. Because what you write today is not the way you build your code in 6 months, is not the way you build your code in a year. And so you should check that in so that when you need to go back in time to service an old version or to patch something old, that the document is still accurate there too. And so, this is not the best analogy perhaps, but I think that it's important to check that stuff in. And so I think Git LFS is a perfectly reasonable thing to use there. And I don't think that there is a point at which it breaks down, maybe.
Is there a file size you can think of that you have worked with that's kind of large, just for perspective?
Yeah, I don't know what large... So large is...
Well, PowerPoint files can be 30, 40, 50 megabytes. And then, of course, video files are just a whole other tier on top of that.
That's right. So interestingly, it's not really the size of the file per se. It's how often it changes. So if you have one movie file and it's never going to change, you can actually just check that right in, because you always need it to build. If you have a 1 megabyte PNG, but it changes every 30 minutes, then you do not want to check that in directly.
Okay.
Because, so it changes what did I say, 30 minutes, twice an hour?
If it changes that often, is a human really changing it or an automated process?
Surely it's an automated process.
Right.
Right. And so that's a little annoying to begin with. But, just as a hypothetical.
Okay.
So what did I say, 30 minutes? So that's 2 megabytes an hour going into your repository. So every day you're adding an additional 48 megabytes to the time it takes to clone that repository.
So Git does not diff or somehow partialize those files? It
will, actually. So it won't in terms of the repository format, but Git will create what's called a pack file. And that's how, when you run git clone, the server will generate a pack file, quote unquote, and send it to you. And you can think of that as just an archive of all of the files, and it does diff between them. So it will do binary deltaing inside of that. So you'll get some space savings. But a PNG, for example, probably doesn't have much in common with its previous version.
Okay.
So it's really a poor candidate for doing binary deltas. And so, right. So as you change that, you're going to really add to the time it takes to clone the repository.
Okay. So the frequency of update. Now, okay, here's the hotspot one. NuGet packages.
Right.
So, just looking at our customers and how frequently they update, they certainly, update every few months if it's active, in some other library revs. But other than that, they just sit there. So, but yet the default tooling in Visual Studio is to not commit them and just pull them down from NuGet every time.
Right.
What do you guys do internally?
We recommend that you don't check in your NuGet packages, and we don't.
Okay.
So we actually have our own private NuGet servers that we restore from. That's kind of a... There's a couple of reasons for that. One, we produce our own NuGet packages that we consume. Two, we want to avoid hitting the internet for NuGet packages too often. NuGet's pretty good, but some package managers are not ideal when it comes to security, maybe. And so we want to make sure that we are installing known good NuGet packages instead of just downloading them from the internet every time. You've seen people breaking into packaging servers and putting malicious packages up. And so this is just another step in making sure that doesn't happen.
Okay. Is that a packaging line of reasoning, or is it a source control and what things should go in and what things should not?
Right, both. So the primarily it's a source control one, though. We don't think you should commit your NuGet packages. They're big and they change a lot. Well, ours are big. We have a lot of them for building Azure DevOps, and they change often enough that it would bloat the repository. Our repository is pretty big already. It's not Windows big. We don't have 4,000 people working in it every day, but it is, pretty big. It takes a little while to clone. I want to reduce that as much as possible.
Okay, got it. All right, so the decision then is the frequency of change. So someone has an individual Visual Studio app, heck, it can be their WPF app that they've been working on for a while, or a brand new .NET Core app. Of course, the defaults kind of push them that way.
It's true. Yeah. But, you've got to be online when you do a build then, that first time at least.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not ideal. We used to talk about developers working on airplanes. I don't know what the offline scenario is now, because most airplanes have internet today. It's crazy.
Yeah, I've taught some classes, and I've been known to say that you should be able to clone the repository and put it on a laptop, ship it to the moon, and the private build should work.
Okay. I understand that thinking.
And so that there are a certain number of category of things that kind of would break down. Shoot, a shared database server, which some teams are still using. Well, that's another barrier.
Right.
Anything that could be an anomaly that's outside of the control of your own workstation.
I'm sympathetic to that, because I want a low friction getting started experience as possible when I'm working in a new repository. If I clone the repository and it doesn't build, I'm probably going to walk away, right? Unless it's my job, and then I guess I've got to figure it out. But on an open source project, if I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be neat if it had this feature? Oh, it doesn't build. We're done here. So right. I'm really sympathetic to what you're saying. However, I'm still going to recommend that you don't check in your NuGet packages. Right.
So some of the I'm a consultant, and some of the different types of software that we've gone in to look at, a storied past. It's been around the block. It's so many, and there's JavaScript files and image files and icons and other things, and it's a big repository. And so you clone it for all kinds of different reasons, and it's just a lot of data. And then this new feature in Azure DevOps Services, and I don't remember when it popped up, there's a little checkbox that says how deep, how many commits back do you really, the shallow, the shallow clone, which is really, really nice, because in order to build it, you don't need all the history from the beginning of time for that repository.
That's right.
When did that come about?
I don't remember, actually. This is in the build definition description. Is that right?
Well, it is, but I'm sure it just taps into Git's shallow
right.
clone feature.
That's right. Yeah, I don't remember. I know that there was an option to, I think in my head, I remember seeing an option that was either shallow or not. I don't remember the actual dialog box, so I don't remember exactly when that came into play. But yeah, some repositories are really well served by doing a shallow clone. It's a little bit, it can be tougher to work with as an end user with that repository on your computer.
Oh, sure. But for instance, the build server.
Yeah.
If you're really going for build time, I mean, how many commits do you really need just to run the build?
Probably one.
Exactly.
Probably.
And that would really cut down just the time to pull it across the network. And even if it's in Azure, I mean, you look at the build logs and it can still, it tells 30 seconds sometimes, or who knows how long.
Sure.
Anything you can trim off.
So here's an interesting reason why you might want some history, more than just one commit anyway. And that is tools like Git version that will create the version number for you from the branch that you are on.
Okay.
So it can figure out how far away you are from, say, I don't know, the v2.4 branch, and it will decide that, oh, this is v2.4, build number 42. It's like, oh, wow, that's pretty clever. So you do need a little bit of history to do that. And I make use of that in a couple of my open source projects. And so that's kind of neat.
Okay. So Microsoft is soon going to own GitHub as well, and Azure repos, you can have unlimited number of Git repositories even for a single project. So what are the big things that you're really thinking about in the overall product team to push forward the state of the art with the Git engine? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I think Azure repos is, that's such a great question that I don't even have a good answer. I think that it's going to be, I think that we're just going to have to look at customer demand, to be completely honest with you. So many of our features came from that, like the Windows support, which is called VFS for Git. It started out as what was called GVFS. Turns out there's another GVFS, the GNOME virtual file system. This is what happens when you let engineers name products. So we changed it to VFS for Git, which is close, but not quite the same.
Always has to be an acronym.
Yeah, I know. And that just was born out of need and customer demand. That customer happened to be Windows, but I think that we'll see more like that. So we'll see more, especially around VFS for Git. We're right now working on Mac support for that, because the Office team also has a giant repository and they want to adopt this, but they build, the Windows team, it turns out, only builds on Windows. Shocking. The Office team has a cross-platform app, both, a Mac OS app, and then they also have Android and iOS apps. Mm-hmm. So they need VFS for Git on Mac OS and Linux. So that I see that as perhaps the most powerful or the biggest piece of functionality that we'll be working on in the immediate future. Okay. But no, I think the thing that I like about the Azure DevOps team is that we are so customer focused, right? You'll see Buck Hodges, who was on the podcast earlier. He's on Twitter. He's interacting with customers. He's listening to customers, and Buck is the director of engineering, right? So he really sets the tone for everybody within the organization. And I think Brian Harry did that before as well. And so I think we're really a customer, maybe more than focused. Maybe we're a customer-obsessed team. And so I think that that's what's going to drive the next set of features. Yeah, well, the group is definitely customer focused, just the transparency coming out of it. And what's being worked on next is pretty interesting. I'm a part of the MVP program and on the NDA lists, and I hear about ideas that might happen, might not, but right. So
really great communication from the team and really aggressive roadmap too.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I like aggressive roadmaps.
Yeah. So you also work on Developer Tools Weekly.
I do.
Tell us about that.
I do. So I realized that the amount of time I actually do spend talking to customers, I was learning a lot about other developer tools, and so I decided to make a newsletter. So every week, unless I forget, like apparently I did last night, every Monday.
Uh-oh.
Turns out this week it's Tuesday. Whoops.
Hey, good enough.
I send out a newsletter with some of the interesting news articles that I've come across, because the developer tools space is really, I think, fascinating, and it's certainly empowering. It's things that we need to know about on to do our jobs. And so I also came up with this because I have a podcast about Git. It's All Things Git is the name of it. And I realized that what I was really doing was talking to other people about developer tools. And so that kind of, I was like, wow, if I could go back and do it all over again, my podcast would be really more about developer tools. And so then I decided to create a newsletter instead. I don't like sleep, it turns out. I just like drinking coffee. So I have time for these things. And so it just shows up in your mailbox. There's interesting stories. There's always interesting stuff going on in our industry. So
you sent one out this morning or Tuesday.
Yes, I did.
And what kinds of things did you include?
Well, so I take a very broad view of what a tool is for a developer. Let me give you an example. The code of conduct in the Linux kernel. Mm-hmm. See how many people like it?
That's right.
So Linus Torvalds created Linux, created Git, and in the Linux kernel mailing list, which is where the discussion happens for patches, right? They don't use GitHub. They don't use a pull request workflow. Mm-hmm. You create a diff and you post it to the mailing list and it gets discussed.
Okay.
And it has not always been the most polite or nice place. And Linus has always suggested that was good, or at least okay. He always said that he would not change his behavior just because people were getting offended by it.
So he enjoyed the candor.
Yeah, he sure did. So you can, Google this and you can just find some explosive rants where he calls people names, and he's always resisted any change to that. But recently he adopted a code of conduct. He decided that maybe he needed to learn better how to interact with other people. I think you should. I linked to it. You can pull it up and you can find the link to his exact words. So I don't want to put any words into his mouth. So I'll just say read what he said. But then it added a code of conduct, and I think that was a pretty monumental change for this workflow, for this place, this part of developer everything. I mean, how many people don't use Linux today? Even Windows runs Linux. It's crazy. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So yeah, that was one of the articles, was digging more into that.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Well, shoot. Codes of conduct. That kind of makes sense. I was walking right by the Microsoft Ignite code of conduct out there in the hallway.
Right.
You think, is it common sense? Maybe not.
It's. Yeah, for most people, it is common sense. It absolutely is. But then if ever anybody decides to step over, not decides or does, they do. If anybody steps over the line, you need to have this written down so that you can actually do something about it, right? Because otherwise, what do you do? As an event organizer, you need to have the rules set so that you can then enforce them. So it's because it's not. Yes, it is common sense, but not everybody has common sense. Not everybody has behavioral patterns that are healthy in a large group.
Yeah. So, All Things Git, your podcast.
Yes.
Not just people can probably search in their favorite podcast directory.
That's right.
What kind of format and what kind of information can people find there?
So, by and large, it's an interview format. I want to have guests on to talk about what they're doing with Git, what they're building around Git. So we've had people on who build GUIs for Git, from the GitHub desktop application to Tower, which is a GUI that I am quite fond of, to Git Kraken, which is another GUI that I'm quite fond of. I think that they're all great. And people who are building new features into Git or using Git for education. One of the most interesting ones in recent memory is we interviewed a guy that found a security hole in Git. So so we talked about how he found it, how the Git community responded and patched it. And so there's a lot of that, and then there's a little bit of how Git works kind of under the hood. Martin Woodward, who we mentioned earlier, is my co-host, and so one day we couldn't find anybody to interview because I slacked. I admit it. I kind of put that off until it was too late, and then so we just talked about how merging works in Git, and it turns out that a lot of people liked that. So,
oh yeah, definitely.
So the format's a little bit all over the place. It's what I decided to do that day, but I enjoy it nonetheless.
So when I'm sitting here across the table with a huge mover and shaker in the Git area of Azure DevOps Services, I can't close the podcast without asking just some questions that lots of teams they're continuing to ask. And while there's certainly massive software systems at big companies, there's thousands and thousands of small teams at mid-sized companies that have a Visual Studio solution and or they have a handful of applications, but they're not these massive ones. And they're constantly looking for rules of thumb, or when would I not? So the first one is, okay, branching strategy. When should I just use feature branching versus when should I use Git flow versus what would drive me to master-based development? And in my situation, what are just the simple rules of thumb to help them choose?
I would urge everybody to just use a trunk-based branching strategy. You don't need Git flow. So my thinking on Git flow is that it was kind of built as a crutch around a lack of good tools. If you don't have a good CI/CD pipeline, all of a sudden having a production branch and a develop branch and a master branch might make sense, so that you can stabilize in one. If you have better tools, you may not need that stabilization branch at all. You can shift left the whole process of validation. So I would, and certainly it's simpler with you when you just have one branch. So I would urge everybody to just do the simplest thing. As simple as you can get away with is going to make you happier. And I think most people can get away with trunk-based development. We can. The Azure DevOps team we're pretty big. We're a couple hundred people working in one repository and largely it is a trunk-based branching strategy. We do kick off a new branch when we release so that we can hotfix into that. So we do actually have a branch that maps to production, and then our master branch that has development. Because we don't do true continuous delivery. We don't deliver features the minute that they're done. We deliver features at the end of every sprint.
Yeah.
So that's why we do it that way. But yeah, I would strongly suggest just keep it as simple as possible.
So in that paradigm, is there no such thing as a pull request because there's no branches?
No. Right. That's a great question. We do pull requests. We don't push directly into master. So we'll spin up what we call topic branches. The difference between a topic branch and a feature branch is entirely semantic.
It's Bob's branch. It's Edward's branch. That's what you're talking about? Yeah.
Exactly. But the idea is, when we talk about it, we often say that feature branches are bad, meaning they're very long-lived. And so that's the difference between a feature branch and a topic branch.
Gotcha.
It's a semantic word game. I apologize, but yeah. So we'll spin up a topic branch. It's very short-lived, and we pull request it into master as soon as it's done.
Okay, so you do branch off of master. Some people work, and then when they think that they're done, they've committed some number of times, they'll do a pull request. That process will happen, then it gets approved, and you suck it into master, and now it's in the mainline build process.
Exactly.
Okay. So are you suggesting that the destination for people is trunk-based development with just short-lived feature or topic, whatever you want to call them, branches? Now, what about the clients that don't have any automated testing and perhaps don't even have an automated build beyond compiling?
Wow.
Now, is it just that they should look forward to that and get those things in place as fast as possible? Because they're probably trying to do a code freeze, and so they use branching to attempt to do that. Everyone's searching for those quality controls, and what you're saying is, in the lack of maturity, in the lack of the DevOps automation, people reach for whatever they can reach for to attempt these quality control tactics.
That's a great summary. Yeah, I think that you should not throw the quality away, right? So if you're using branches in order to, I don't know, to try to keep your quality high, I think that that's a laudable goal. And so you should not just, throw that away because I said to use trunk-based development.
Well, they might do a code freeze so that they can push something to the QA server without changing it out from under them.
Right, exactly.
People do that.
I think that they should keep doing that for now. I think that they should indeed invest in some quality continuous integration and testing into a pipeline. And once they've done that, then I would suggest a trunk-based branching strategy. But yeah, don't just throw away the quality for now.
Okay, well that's good feedback. That your statement is, we're going to land at trunk-based development with very short-lived branches with pull requests, and you need to get there.
That's right. Don't jump in and throw your quality away to get there. Yeah, but
gotcha. That
is the target, I think.
Okay, awesome. And another one is, how much do I put in the Git repository? For instance, you've seen everything. Let's say you have three different. You have a Git repository per company, per department, per team, per application, and now the early ones are extreme, but you've seen multiple different applications packed in the same Git repository where you say, wait a minute, maybe we need to split this up, or the over-the-top microservices where you have Git repositories everywhere, and then maybe it's too much. So how does the listener decide?
That's a good question. And I have seen everything. And, Google does put everything in their company in a single repository. Facebook puts everything in their company in a single repository. I think that goes
one repository.
Yeah. It's a mono repo strategy. It's called a mono repo. One repository, every product in it, doesn't matter what. Doesn't matter if they're related to each other.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a little crazy. So we talk about the Windows repository being big. Facebook has an equally large repository. They're using Mercurial. Google has an equally bigger repository, and for all their products, and they're using a custom sort of source control system that they built. I think that might go a little overboard. I want a repository per thing that gets versioned and shipped together. So if you have, let's say, a back-end service and a front-end service, I think putting them in the same repository is perfectly fine, because you're going to iterate them together and ship them ultimately together. If you change the API on the back end, you're going to need to change the front end to talk to it. It's so much easier if they're in the same repository versus trying to simultaneously rev these two separate repos. That's really
when
painful.
Really they go together.
They go together. Yeah, put them together.
Yeah. If you're Angular, Web API, and a SQL database, one can't live without the other two.
That's exactly right. And so I don't think that you need to start pulling things out into their own separate repositories. And to take that to the logical extreme, Windows is kind of like that, and that's kind of why it's in its own giant repository. Is Notepad ships on the same ISO as the drivers, as Candy Crush. Do we actually make Candy Crush? I don't even know. I don't know who makes it. All I know is it ships with Windows. So there's some description of how to get it into the build. And so I think that should all go together.
Yeah, why does it ship with Windows? Scott Hansel made a point this morning in breakout session to show his Windows 3.1 file manager running on Windows 10.
Awesome. I love it.
So, well, that's awesome. Those are some big topics that every kind of team asks over and over again, and they come up with all kinds of different answers. And I think Buck shared that, Buck Hodges, he shared that all of Azure DevOps Services was they tried several things and then ultimately merged back into, or you guys merged back into a single Git repository instead of several.
That's right.
And just in the last year, right?
I've only been back for a little over a year.
Okay.
So it's been in one since I've been back.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And there's, I think if I recall, 30-something independent processes that need to be deployed. So it's not just one thing. There's multiple different services running around, but they're all a part of the same orchestrated system.
That's right.
And so they're versioned together. You're not going to have version 1 of something and version 19 of the other happily playing together. They all have to move. Maybe they're moving at different speeds, but in generally, it is one product.
That's right. Yeah, and again, that's how we ship everything. We just kind of ship everything together. Even though they are largely, you can think of them as microservices, but generally when we deploy it all at once. Yeah. And if we ever change that, then I think that's when it's time to start breaking out into a separate Git repository.
That's a good point. If you do ever change shipping it all at once, then it probably means that it has become two products.
Right.
At that point.
Right. And the way they talk to each other is probably somewhat different.
Yeah. Awesome. So this was a lot of great information. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners before we wrap up?
Go adopt Azure pipelines as well. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about Azure repos, but I'm spending a lot more of my time looking at Azure pipelines lately. At some point, you realize you worked on version control for a long time, and you're like, wow, Azure pipelines is really kind of cool. So I've been playing around with that a lot, just to, it was quite by accident. When we announced our offer for free pipelines for open source projects. I maintain several open source projects. So all of a sudden I started moving them over to Azure pipelines, and that's really, it kind of lit a fire. So I've been playing a lot with that. So I think it's great.
So you have a public projects org now on Azure pipelines?
I have several. There's dev.azure.com/libgit2.
Okay.
And that's, so we used to have multiple CI systems, one for Windows and then another one for Linux and Mac, and maintaining that was really painful. So we were able to move over to Azure Pipelines for everything, and the simplification that it's made in my life has been great. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
And so the deployment destination, would that be NuGet, or what destinations does your pipeline deploy to?
So libgit2 is straight C. So we don't really offer much for people. I'm a little embarrassed to say. So
you have to post it somewhere, I would think, right?
So we don't actually. Okay. So what we do is we use Azure Pipelines just for the CI build validation, and then when we release, we tag a release and tell people, hey, we've released, and you can now download this tar file if you want. And compile it, because we're like some old school Unix C hackers. Then libgit2 Sharp is a .NET wrapper on top of that. Then there's Rugged, which is a Ruby wrapper on top of libgit2, and so they actually do have deployment mechanisms. libgit2 Sharp does create a NuGet package. You're absolutely right, but libgit2 itself does not.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, man, that was a lot of information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. All right, we'll get back to the conference. And Thanks to listeners for listening to the Azure DevOps podcast, and keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.